Live from the City Building in Athens, Ohio, your local source for live city meetings, TGC 15 presents Athens City Council.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone who has joined Athens City Council to view and listen to a presentation by Paul Fenn, Renewable Energy and Local Energy Independence CEO. It's our great fortune to have so many people here that we will need additional chairs, and we may be getting those shortly. And we will be rebroadcasting this on the cable channel, on the government channel. At this point, though, for three other council members, all would like to ask you to join us in a round of applause for Mr. Fenn. Even though we haven't heard him yet. But before he starts, we're going to hear Spruce Hauser is going to read a letter from our colleague, Mr. Allahu Ghazni, who's off on a destination wedding, his own to be exact. So, Spruce, take it away.
Had a good excuse to be absent.
He does.
In the Dominican Republic. He just got married a few days ago.
Yes.
And but Elahu sent me a message he'd like me to read to the people attending this event tonight. He said, I would like to sincerely thank Gary Hauser for inviting Mr. Fenn to Athens and for his important work on environmental issues over the years. I would also like to thank Mr. Paul Fenn for bringing his expertise and knowledge on green energy to Athens. I hope we can work together in the near future. Also, I give my thanks to Nancy Bain for helping to plan and facilitate this meeting. It is clear that there must be a drastic change to reduce greenhouse gases in order to protect our world from the imminent threat of climate change. There has not yet been a substantial effort at the state or national level to combat climate change. We have a moral responsibility to act at the local level, to begin a serious effort to reduce the environmental impact of our own energy consumption in a bottom-up approach to change course. Our community can be at the forefront of this emerging concept of local solutions to global climate change. We cannot make the mistake of underestimating the urgency of the situation. We cannot count on anybody else to solve this problem for us, and we cannot afford to wait. The time to act is now. And I might want to also add that Elahu Ghazni is the chair of the Environment Committee. So that's the statement that was sent.
Thank you very much. And we would now like to proceed with a presentation of PowerPoint from Mr. Fenn, and then we will have questions. And we will probably try to hold you to 3 minutes when you ask your question, so Mr. Fenn has time to answer. We've had experience with this before. Sometimes people talk more than the answer requires. So, Mr. Fenn, I've done Walmart, so I can do this.
Thank you, Nancy, and members of the council, Mr. Mayor. Pleasure to be here. Great to be in Ohio. I come from San Francisco and have not really worked in Ohio since helping the legislature draft the 1999 law that authorized community choice aggregation here in Ohio in conjunction with a number of groups, including Citizen Action. It's always at a distance on conference calls and emails, and so it's very nice to be here. I'm impressed with how lovely the state is, really. I thought Ohio was just a tarmac with a bunch of factories on it. And, I drove down through here and was shocked to see all the forests, and it's really a lovely place. So it's very good to be here. I want to start out with the title here, this term climate works. My company, Local Power, which is based in San Francisco, has been working on energy and on community choice aggregation for about 15 years. And the latest incarnation of our concept for an appropriate response to climate change is the basic concept of public works. And so the term climate works is an effort to express the concept of public works as a climate response. Next, Gary, please. I'm going to start out with bad news, and it's pretty bad. there is a growing pessimism among scientists observing the phenomenon of climate change, those in the front lines who are watching the icebergs, who are counting the CO2 in the ice, who are watching the rate of the thaw. Among the scientists, there is a growing conviction that it is too late to stop the changes taking place. You may have read this, that it's been forecasted this summer will be the first summer the North Pole completely melts into water for the first time probably in some 20,000 years. The last time it melted was a beginning of a climate crisis, a climate collapse. And obviously the evidence that's occurred is devastating. And yet the effects are not felt locally until it's too late. It's one of the kind of psychological problems with climate change, is that the effects aren't felt locally until it's too late to do anything about it. And it really tests in a sense, the basic principles of the Enlightenment, the notion that democracies can make rational decisions in response to reasoned knowledge of what's happening rather than immediate emotional experience. We have an observed phenomenon, it's undeniable, and yet the question is, at what point will we get serious about this event? And so there is increasingly among scientists who see a lack of seriousness in the political debate, a growing desperation, and that desperation has led many of them to conclude that nuclear power is the only solution to the crisis. One of the main messages I want to convey today is that desperation is ill-founded, that there is an opportunity today to take meaningful action on climate change. It doesn't mean we can stop what's already happened. It doesn't mean that we can prevent a catastrophe, which is obviously happening already. But it does mean that we can eliminate the cause of climate change. We can circumscribe the event. We can respond to this event and not merely stand by and watch it happen, or resort to the phenomenon of nuclear power. Please go to the next slide. Now, part of the pessimism is that even in the United States, even the leaders are not leading. And it's more bad news, I'm afraid. I have to add to bad news, which is California, the state from which I come, is known for having taken first action on carbon. Assembly Bill 32 set in place greenhouse gas reduction targets for the state. The state was also first to adopt a renewable portfolio standard and is regarded as a leader, as a kind of model for other states in the national discourse. And yet, a look at California as a state is disappointing. In fact, the utilities are not complying with the renewable portfolio standard law, and they have effectively forced the hand of state regulators to loosen standards, sort of extra statutorily authorizing utilities to not comply. They are not imposing penalties in response to noncompliance. And to me, the event looks like a kind of third world collapse of state authority, where the states can pass whatever laws they like, they're not enforced, the private sector does not comply, and then the authority of the state to enforce its decisions and its laws is then diluted. It demoralizes the political debate, and effectively there's a kind of political death spiral that occurs where there simply is a perception of impotence on the part of the government to do anything. That kind of political collapse is very dangerous, and I believe, and I want to say today, that that collapse results from an age-old ideology really about energy, which forces our thinking into a kind of policy box, a cage, an intellectual cage that limits what we consider to be possible. And the cage is really, ironically, is defined by our unconsciously held economic theories about how things have to work and how things are limited. Specifically, Gary, please, the next slide. Specifically, that markets have to deliver the solution to climate change. In the national debate, and really in the international debate, there's an assumption that the role of government in climate change is it's a finessing agency. It's limited to finessing change in the private sector. It can change its subsidies. It can change its taxes. It can set standards and targets and goals. It can establish regulatory regimes to influence the behavior of these corporations. You can count the corporations that are causing climate change on, if not on your hands, on two sets of hands. There are very few entities that are actually causing this crisis. And they'll turn around and say, we're all causing it. It's our lifestyle that's causing it. I would hold today that that is part of the box, the policy box that we're stuck in. There are two camps. One camp says, it's sort of the Dick Cheney school, that says that conservation is virtue. It's moral virtue. That if more people bought Priuses and more people invested in energy efficiency, now Al Gore made this mistake in his film as well, that if people individually as consumers were more virtuous in their consumption patterns, that it would solve the problem. That's one school. Then there's the technology school that says we have to wait, the kind of Google school that says we have to find the great earth-shattering technology. E is less than C. Find the technology that's cheaper than coal and you found the solution. I would suggest to you that both are wrong. We cannot wait for markets to deliver the solution. We cannot wait for technology, and we cannot wait for individuals to become more virtuous to solve this problem. Instead, please carry the next slide. Real change for a sense of the precedence or background of dramatic changes in response to a perceived public need or a perceived crisis. One example, a very good one on the technology side, is telecommunications. The transformation of telecommunications over the past 30 years is revolutionary. From the 1970s, when the telephone company owned your telephone, called it a terminal, and would not allow even fax machines to be used except for military applications, to today, when the phone in your pocket is more advanced than the computers that control the grid. That's a fundamental truth at the time. The grid has no intelligence in it, but your cell phone is more powerful than a mainframe computer was 40 years ago. That's a transformation, and that is the kind of transformation that is needed in the energy industry. Not merely an incremental change, a mitigation of the current system, a 10, 20, 30% improvement. We're talking about a total transformation that fundamentally changes the nature of energy. That's what's required. It will not come incrementally. This quote from Bob Galvin, the former CEO of Motorola, expresses an interest on Wall Street and among the banks to deliver this kind of change. And in a sense, consensus on climate has been achieved in the United States. The question is, how do we get there? Please go to the next slide. How do we get to an 80% carbon solution? Now, implicitly, an 80% carbon solution means 100% carbon solution in the power sector. It means a 90% solution in the transportation sector, and it means a 60% solution everywhere else, because the hierarchy of influence of governments goes from top to bottom in that order. Governments have enormous control over the energy sector. They have limited control over the transportation sector, and they have very little control over the other third of the cause of carbon in the world. And so 100% solution. If you consider 100% solution in the next few decades, that means that we must physically replace the entire energy supply, physically, in just a few decades. This is a non-incremental event, and the public works precedent, again, is the most appropriate kind of paradigm to view what has to occur. If we go back to please, the next slide. If we go back to precedents in history where public works were implemented, the most famous was the cholera epidemics of the mid-19th century. There were several waves of cholera epidemics in the United States, which were far more devastating in Europe than they were here, but they were significant. And New York City was the epicenter of some major epidemics. Proposals, of course, the epidemics were concentrated in the ghettos. And the debate around the cholera, and some of you may have studied, I know there's at least one historian in the room, and there have been books written that I studied about the cholera debate. And initial debate in New York focused on the relationship between cholera and poverty. And the Chamber of Commerce in New York believed and declared that cholera was caused by public immorality, by immigrants, primarily Irish immigrants, who were dirty, promiscuous, and drunkards, and that it was their lifestyle that was causing disease, and that the solution to the cholera was to improve their lifestyle. Very reminiscent of the conservationist virtue school of technology that says we have to improve our lives. It's our fault. We have to improve how we live. Now, there's validity to the notion of changing how we live. I'm not saying it's not valid, but the notion that we could achieve 100% transformation of the energy system over a few decades through that approach is inane and irresponsible. It is physically impossible to do so. Over the course of 2 decades, the debate raged in New York City around proposals for municipal water and sewer system. Chamber of Commerce called it a form of communism. The violation of private property, the digging of trenches across people's yards, nefarious pipes linking everyone's homes, formerly isolated, discrete homes were now connected through underground networks. All of our refuse combined into pipeline systems. They consider this to be dangerous precedent. And yet today, who would say that owning a toilet makes you a communist? It's unthinkable and absurd. And yet that's precisely the same sort of quality of debate that we find today around public interference in the energy sector. Now, we are coming out of the Cold War, after all, and the Cold War was largely fought around preventing communism in the energy sector. There is a powerful resistance to government interference in energy, and I would make the case, and I have many times before, that's precisely what we have to face, the fear of government interference in the energy sector, because waiting for the energy industry to deliver the solution to the problem that it has caused is effectively waiting for Godot. Godot will never arrive. The growth in carbon emissions is outstripping all action to reduce carbon by far. In fact, it's laughable. And the U.S. increase in carbon since Kyoto is very disturbing. And that's what's leading these scientists and opinion leaders to declare nuclear the only solution. Because a look at the math, please, the next slide, would tend to make one very pessimistic. Now, just in terms of my own background, I started about 15 years ago and wrote community choice law in Massachusetts, and then went on to help to draft similar laws in Ohio and New Jersey and California. And another law was passed in Rhode Island. So there are now 5 states that allow city governments to decide what kind of energy to purchase as communities through their local government, through a process very similar to the selection of municipal garbage collection, the franchise authority of cities, which is a 500-year-old authority, part of the organic authority of cities in most states. I know that Ohio has a very strong home rule tradition, and the authority of cities to protect the public health and welfare is the foundation of this authority to award exclusive contracts to private entities to provide essential services to a community. Community choice, in a sense, is a reinvention of that really age-old authority. And so I've spent the last 15 years developing this approach, and it went from Massachusetts in 1995 and was passed in 97 to Ohio. In 98, it was passed in 99, and to California, really. I also helped in New Jersey, but in California, I drafted a community choice bill in the late 90s, and it was finally adopted in 2002. Next slide, please, Gary. And I'm sorry, Gary, I missed one point on there. Would you mind going back? Over on the right, you see invented solar H-bonds. Now, this is a term of industry, and I should explain it. It relates to public works. Community choice, from the point of view of public works, in a 50,000 foot perspective, gives a community control over the spending of funds that it already spends every month on its electric bill. So every one of us here pays an electric bill every month. Currently, it goes to the incumbent monopoly utility. Community choice allows the local government to hold hearings and decide what kind of service does it want, basically to reinvent the service and to go out, find a new supplier. So there's revenues that are currently going to conventional power, in your case, coal power, predominantly coal power, some nuclear power, I believe, to cleaner energy sources, a cleaner energy supplier. That revenue enables you to finance new facilities. And the H-Bond Authority is something that I drafted actually after watching the progress of community choice in Ohio in the formation of the Northeast Ohio Public Energy Council, which is the largest aggregation in the United States. It includes 6 counties around the suburbs and exurbs and rural areas around Cleveland, 6 counties, 100 and something municipalities, 620,000 customer homes, which is about 1.5 million people that purchase energy through that community choice aggregation. When they formed, there was another group in Northwest Ohio that was trying to find suppliers, and they were having a great deal of trouble finding suppliers because of problems with access to transmission. And so I was in California sort of trying to take it to the next level, and I drafted a revenue bond authority for San Francisco, which required a public vote in that case. Most cities don't need a public vote, but we went out and ran a campaign, and the voters approved it. This was effectively a traditional revenue bond financing vehicle, very similar to the kinds of bond issuances that finance bridges. It's another example of the use of municipal public works to build essential infrastructure. There were no big bridges until Robert Moses of New York invented the New York Transportation Authority, the New York Parks, I can't remember, it was the New York Parks Authority, and these were used to finance bridges and to collect tolls in order to repay bonds. This basic model of issuing public debt and establishing the authority to collect revenue to repay the debt is the essential instrument of public works. The solar H bonds, we call them H bonds because of the symbolism of hydrogen, the sun, and it happened to by luck to be Proposition H that passed when the bond authority was passed. So we call them H bonds. Is essentially based on a traditional authority to issue bonds. These two basic components are what caused the opportunity that I'm presenting to you today. It is the opportunity to control revenue in a public manner and then issue debt in a public manner. It creates a new kind of economic opportunity for renewable energy. Please, Gary. How am I in time? Okay. All right, thank you. So, community choice aggregation, what is it? It is the authority of cities to aggregate the private sector and the public sector, residents, businesses, the street lights, the municipal buildings, and loads. In Ohio, that authority includes both electricity purchasing and gas purchasing. Now, electricity and gas, arguably, I would say in your case, probably causes over half of all of your greenhouse gas emissions for your community. So you have, through this vehicle, the authority to condition your use of energy to impact over half of your entire footprint, your carbon footprint. This community choice authorizes the city to solicit bids from competitive suppliers to come in to provide commodity service so everyone receives their monthly energy from this new entity. And it leaves the current utility intact as a distribution company. It delivers the power to you. It can either read the meter and send the bill, or the new supplier can read the meter and send the bill. That's up to local control. Please, next slide. So essentially, it doesn't require that the city take over energy, that it become an energy supplier. Instead, it simply authorizes the selection of a new company to come in over a period of time under local terms and conditions. In Massachusetts, the key sort of political agent that got my initial bill adopted was based in Cape Cod, and they really did the political lifting there. Shortly after drafting the bill, my chairman was removed from his position because no one was happy with this bill. Nobody wanted it. And so he was no longer in a position to push it. But these communities down in Cape Cod had a number of idealists, really a very shockingly small number of people who pushed this thing through the legislature and formed the Cape Light Compact. It's had continuous service for electricity and gas, emphasizing energy efficiency and solar photovoltaics since 1998. It's very popular. You can find it on the web. And then there's NOPEC in Ohio. It's 400,000 customers at its low point. It's ranged between 400 and 650,000 customers over the past 7 or 8 years. Next slide, please. When NOPEC did what it did, it was a really interesting story, because I'd gone out to California, and the energy crisis had hit when NOPEC signed its contract with Green Mountain Energy, and NOPEC had gone out to market just looking for cheaper power. They're not environmentalists up there. They just wanted to find someone who could offer a discount for small customers. And so they went out to market, and Green Mountain Energy came in, backed by BP, and they offered a portfolio that had no coal in it and no nuclear. It had only gas and a small increment of renewables. But they also guaranteed a 5% discount. So these communities, which weren't even looking for cleaner energy, achieved an announcement from BP, a 33% net greenhouse gas reduction and a 70% across-the-board pollution reduction for 1 million people with a guaranteed discount. Now this, in terms of conventional market economics, this is not possible. To have greener power, you must pay more, right? Well, no. And it's one of the lessons of the non-linear economics of energy in energy markets which are not competitive, which have chronic manipulation and collusion problems. When you establish leverage in the market as consumers, that you can indeed perform miracles. And it was a miracle to us. It was a real shot in the arm. It helped us get the law adopted by the legislature in California in 2002. I've really spent the last 9 years very focused on California. I was born in California in the north, and focused on San Francisco. The political leadership in San Francisco really pushed this thing through and has been the lead city there implementing. It's a very large market, $17 billion per year, and there are now over 50 jurisdictions, somewhere around 20% of the state that is trying to implement this policy, with San Francisco in the lead, and the Bay Area as kind of the leading cluster. There, Marin County is probably right behind. Please, next slide, Gary. And so I want to go back to the economics and to this question of price, because it is always the key factor, and it's the key factor for those that turn to nuclear, is that they accept this economic ideology that maintains that green power is more expensive. It's not. The issue is finance. The first thing that allows green power to compete with brown power is the use of municipal financing. It's the basic element of public works, the cost of capital. Something that's little known and little appreciated in the overall energy debate is the capital burden of renewable energy compared to conventional energy. If you're a bank and you're going to underwrite a power plant, you're going to put down about 10% of the life cycle cost of a power plant's power on the plant itself, on the steel. Only 10%. 90% of the cost of that plant and of its capacity that's sold from the plant is the fuel, not the plant. So in effect, fuel is a kind of amortization vehicle. It's financing. You don't have to put all the money down. It's a kind of mortgage. You pay some up front. Most of it you pay as you use. With renewable energy, there's no fuel. And so all the pricing around the cost of the fuel is based upon the fact that you've got to put 100% down, not 10% down. And so the cost of your capital has an enormous, exponentially disproportionate impact on the cost of your power. Could we go to the next slide? This is an example, and I know it's a complicated spreadsheet slide, but we design portfolios for cities, and this is a wind farm. On the left-hand column, you have a privately financed wind farm. On the right-hand column, you have a publicly financed wind farm. All the factors are the same. The only factor that's different is the fact of its public financing. And if you look down on the third row from the bottom, you'll see the cost of electricity from this wind farm. The privately financed wind farm is 11.5 cents per kilowatt hour. The publicly financed wind farm is 6.8 cents, just under 7 cents. So the difference in cost of green power is dramatically lower. I mean, that's around 30% lower when I look at it. Next slide, please. So the real core phenomenon is that lower cost of capital for a capital burdensome technology. The second is the rate-setting authority that is created through community choice aggregation. This allows a city to decide how it's going to charge for its power. That is, how much will residents pay, small businesses, medium businesses. It allows the city to attenuate more complex energy products, to not merely sell electricity to you as a consumer, but to finance an energy facility for you as an owner. It allows the community to effectively finance your energy future and to invest, and that you see on the bottom there, to invest in demand-side technology. So, and this demand-side technology is a poorly understood and underappreciated category of energy. I want to, in the blue there, you see virtual capacity. The word virtual capacity is already cheaper than coal. Now, virtual capacity is a relatively new term of industry and energy, and it emerged from the so-called power purchase agreement, or PPA, approach to selling technology that's emerged in just the last few years. I know that some of you are aware of this, the emergence of third-party finance of photovoltaics in the U.S. It's captured the market. A great deal of the new growth in solar photovoltaics is coming from companies that approach customers not with a proposed sale of solar panels, but instead with a proposed sale of solar power, on-site solar power. So you receive an offer from a solar company not to buy panels, but to buy power from panels on your roof. We'll put it on your roof, we'll pay for it, we'll sell you the power for X number of years, and we'll take the federal tax cut. We'll see to it that the system pays for itself, and once it pays for itself, we go away and you own the panels. It's kind of a new deal in solar, very popular, lots of growth. If you take it to the next level, which is what we're really doing here, you're issuing bonds to finance solar, so you have a lower cost of capital, and you're not limited to photovoltaics, which is a relatively high cost renewable resource. You can invest in demand-side technology. Now, demand-side technology are energy efficiency, more efficient lights, as you appear to have here. Demand response technology that effectively automates energy use in buildings. A public housing apartment building with 1,000 refrigerators can receive refrigeration pump automation systems that serialize the pumps so that they're not all on at the same time. So the carbon profile for refrigerators can be dramatically reduced. The cost of service to the building, because the peak load on the building can be cut in half, is reduced, so the overall cost of energy to the building can be reduced. These technologies, which are off the shelf, they've been around for decades, are so cheap that if you finance them and and convert a sale of equipment into a levelized cost sale of power, called virtual capacity, it's cheaper than coal today. The ability of cities to finance technologies that reduce energy use without lowering the quality of lighting and heating in the building at prices that are cheaper than coal is truly a radical opportunity. Now, one would ask, well, why aren't the utilities doing it? Next slide, please. By shaping supply and demand, really a new game in energy becomes achievable. No longer are you simply trying to replace a brown power plant with a green power plant. In fact, any of you may have read James Lovelock's work. James Lovelock is a British scientist who led the charge to revive the nuclear industry in response to the climate crisis. Why did he do this? Because he's a scientist, and he studied the basic arithmetic of carbon. He looked first at wind power. The wind power is known to be the cheapest renewable resource. So he assumed this would be the most logical place to start for achieving a carbon solution. Upon cursory study, he realized that wind power is a radically limited technology. Why? Because it relies, generally speaking, upon transmission to deliver it into cities from remote locations. Renewable resources are intermittent. A commercial wind power facility produces power between 20 and 30% of the time. In other words, between 70 and 80% of the time, it's not producing energy. Now, they're still viable economic investments. However, from a carbon perspective, they become physically limited in terms of how much carbon reduction they can deliver. Effectively, they're limited to a 20 or 30% solution. He observed this himself, and he said, okay, well, let's look across the board here. What else could we do? Solar photovoltaics. He looked at solar. He looked at the current growth curves of solar, the current role of solar in energy markets. It's nothing. It's on the scale of the pet rock. It's a tiny, visionary, potentially radical, but currently insignificant component of energy markets. The scale of energy markets is really the problem. And to get significant carbon reduction in those markets requires such a transformation that any rational person looking at the carbon arithmetic will realize it's just not probable we're going to get there based on that technology either. So he was essentially, Mr. Lovelock, driven into the arms of nuclear power. He saw no alternative. He's not an irresponsible man. But I studied his work. I read every book that he wrote, and I did find some flaws in his thinking. The first flaw was that he didn't look at demand-side technology. He just isn't on the list. He's a supply-side thinker. And lo and behold, look at the climate discussion. It's all supply-side thinking. It's, we're going to go from brown power to green power. It won't work. You can't do it. It's physically impossible to achieve. And that's what the utilities will tell you. It won't work. It's impossible to achieve. They don't look at the demand-side technology either. Why don't they? Very simple economics. They own the transmission lines. Most of they are energy importers. Transmission lines are energy importation systems. The primary investment of electric utilities and the primary profit center of electric utilities is transmission systems. They make money like long-distance companies, not really from burning, but from delivering. And what Mr. Lovelock realized was that you just can't get carbon unless you actually reduce throughputs, unless you reduce sales. If you reduce sales, then all the entities of the world, public and private, that own transmission systems are in deep trouble. And it's profound trouble. It's not a casual problem. It's not a moral problem on their behalf. They truly own debt attached to these assets, this infrastructure. You'll notice today, many utilities are saying we need more transmission to deal with the energy crisis. They want to build more transmission. Now, this is a carbon nightmare. To the extent that the energy system is further centralized, bigger systems, larger systems, as if the energy shortage could be solved by having bigger pipe, this sort of metaphor of the energy crisis. The carbon implications are devastating. In fact, the only way to get significant amount of carbon out of the system is to decentralize the system, reduce dependence on transmission, phase down centralized power plants, and build up local power generation, and invest heavily in demand-side technology, dramatically and heavily. Now, one of the casualties, and community choice allows this. Why? Because community choice aggregators don't own transmission systems. They don't even own distribution systems. There's no harm to the community in investing heavily in technologies that reduce throughputs. There's no harm. And because the technology's virtual capacity can be sold on a levelized basis at a price that's lower than coal, it won't raise the price of your power. That's why it's a radical opportunity. It is also radically threatening to the owners of transmission infrastructure, to their future, in much the same way that Skype, the peer-to-peer telephone software, is fundamentally threatening to fiber owners decentralized technologies threaten those infrastructure owners. And they're in a pinch. I don't blame them. But the notion that electric utilities should be asked to solve the carbon crisis is inane. The notion that they can be regulated or finessed or influenced or motivated to reduce sales is irresponsible. It's politically irresponsible to place responsibility upon them. They have to be pushed aside. New entities have to come in to facilitate good economics to replace what they own and to basically to shrink them, to make them less significant, less important in the market. This change has to occur. For them it's catastrophic, but it doesn't have to be for the economy. Next, please. So this is the basic kind of economic model we're talking about. You have the bond issuance, you have, as a community choice aggregator with rate setting authority, you have the ability to go up to 50,000 feet, analyze your energy usage, and come up with the best available technology on the demand side and the supply side, package it together as a single public works investment. It's more complex, it's more attenuated, but it is a public works project. And bundle that into a new power service for the community that involves the issuance of public financing. And those finances are paid for exclusively through the energy bill. They don't require additional expenditures or general fund exposure to repay those debts. Next, please. Now, if you back up and go back to the cholera crisis or the bridge phenomenon, the Robert Moses phenomenon, if you really think about it, it's rather obvious that if we're looking at it clearly at an 80% carbon solution, the cities have to do this. Cities are permitting authorities. If you wanted to plan a lot of infrastructure and do it in an efficient, orderly, rational way, the most appropriate agent of that planning is the entity that issues permits for industrial facilities. And so if you look at the failure of renewable distributed generation, which is local power, technologies that have been in business with off-the-shelf technology for about a decade and a half, really waiting to break into energy markets, they've been stifled. They've gotten nowhere. They're dead in the water. There's some photovoltaic growth, but generally speaking, they're all sitting on their hands. Why? They have a one-off approach to selling their product. They're trying to, basically, they have to pay money on advertising to get a customer. They have very high permitting, and it costs them a great deal of money to get a customer. And so if you look at solar integrators or solar installers, the marketing cost is tremendous. In terms of the overall cost of the solar when it's up on your roof, you're paying a lot for marketing for that company because they had to spend a lot of time finding you. With a community choice aggregation, there's no marketing cost. The city has a direct channel to every customer, can offer them products on the electric bill, knows who they are, has general knowledge about their energy use. That knowledge enables a whole different approach to rolling out the technology rather than just waiting for a random spread pattern of people that have the money and the idealism to buy these systems. The distributed generation vendors have no regulatory leverage. They have to interconnect with utilities that are hostile to them, that can delay their interconnect, drive up their construction costs. They have a high cost of capital. In order to finance facilities, they have to go to banks that are charging twice what a municipal revenue bond would cost for the same facility. Deregulation. Competitive suppliers have the same problems in the market, also largely solved through community choice aggregation. They have a very high marketing cost. If you go back to California when the market collapsed, Ken Lay, who was largely scapegoated for the crisis, was the first to announce that the market was failing. In fact, he pulled his company, Enron, out of the market 3 months after it opened, announcing that it cost him $270 just to find a customer. It just didn't work. And community choice provides regional markets for these suppliers. They don't have to spend money on advertising. They just have to put together competitive products and spend money on the quality of the product rather than spending money on billboards and TV ads. the high customer churn, the instability of deregulated markets with customers switching from one company to another. If you want to make long-term investments in infrastructure, you can't have high customer churn. It just doesn't support a long-term approach to energy. And community choice provides that stability. Leverage with the utility company. Most utilities have franchise agreements with municipalities, and that provides cities with significant leverage over the utilities' behavior. Most cities own the wires paths of utilities. Their entire business rests on real estate owned by the cities in which they operate. Additional leverage to cooperate on interconnect, to reduce those construction delays, and by doing that, reduce the cost of the power that's generated. The exposure to wholesale markets is a huge problem. The markets are non-competitive. The utilities exercise significant market power, and they use it. So that competitors that come in and try to serve communities have enormous leverage by developing and emphasizing local power resources rather than depending just on remote power plants that are under control of utilities and basically hostile players. Finally, again, the low-cost capital. The thing that killed Enron was their dependence on commercial credit. The energy trading system relies on banks to provide that credit, and the withdrawal of credit by banks can be devastating to these companies. And one of the things that is driving up natural gas prices right now is speculation in markets that are held up on short-term credit. That volatility isn't just a function of the physical resource, it's a function of the market structure that delivers the resource. And speculation causes volatility. It's as simple as that. By investing in fuel-free local power and fuel-free local virtual capacity, you're physically reducing your exposure to that speculation and to the volatility of those fuels. Next, please. So once you get out of what I call the public policy box, where the role of government is simply to finesse and influence and regulate or police, instead its role is to build, to plan, to build, to finance, to own, then a different view of things emerges. You really you're looking at a municipal public works project. The solution to climate change is a municipal public works project. The nature, the challenges, the opportunities of a public works project are entirely different from the challenges and opportunities of a market. Next slide, please. As my company, Local Power, because we view ourselves as advisors to local governments in planning and negotiating with suppliers for public works projects, we've partnered with Booz Allen Hamilton, which is the nation's largest public works consultancy. They focus on large infrastructure projects. And Nixon Peabody, which is the second largest power plant finance law firm that specializes in municipal side of the deal. So we have some great partners that give us depth. This has enabled us to sell the concept of large projects to San Francisco and other cities as public works projects whose risk is circumscribed and managed, and not simply an open question of who's going to pay for what and what happens if things go wrong. Next, please. The idea of a rollout is quite different from the idea of a market. If you look at a city, rooftops of a city, I mean, every guy in solar imagines, what could we do if you could just cover all the rooftops of the city with solar panels? Well, if you're operating a market, you can't do that. All you can do is put up your billboards and your advertisements and wait for people to sign up. If they sign up, then you have to go and survey the rooftop and see if the roof's pointed the right way, if the roof's going to fall down the next 20 years. Look at the tariff, what tariff the customer's under to determine the rate of payback on the investment. And then you have to make a decision as to whether it's a good location, advisable location. In a rollout, it's quite different. The roofs of your city are simply a platform for infrastructure, period. The city can acquire that rooftop. It can lease it from you. It's obviously the option of the owner of the building whether they want to volunteer the rooftop. But no longer are you required to sell a product to that rooftop owner. the sort of thinning down or the narrowing of the opportunity through a market approach is quite shocking if you think about it. In the wireless industry, we brought in some people from wireless because wireless companies acquire rooftops. That's how they build networks. They go around, they send real estate cowboys around, and engineers, and the engineers say, well, I'd like to have that roof and that roof and that roof, in order to design and software programs design cells that overlap so you have coverage. And then they go and they identify the owner of the building at the county plat maps, and then they go and call them up and negotiate a deal. They give them free phones, and they give them $1,000 a month or whatever the market bears for that rooftop. It's real estate. It's not a customer to sell a phone to. It's an unrelated problem. It's infrastructure. And so it really is a totally different kind of paradigm for how to do it, not merely a different financing vehicle, but physically different. And once you get to back to the carbon level, 50,000 feet, in order to reduce carbon, you've got to reduce load at the substation. You've got to physically decongest the grid. Grids are magnetic fields. And if a random spread pattern of photovoltaics, if you just randomly place solar around your community, you'll find that the carbon impact, the load impact of the substation is very unpredictable. Why? Because high congestion areas in the microgrid where there's very little room for capacity will take power back at a very different rate from low congestion areas in the microgrid. In other words, the location of local power is really the appropriate sort of engineering level. The choice of a location is largely determined by conditions of the grid at that location, not by whether someone in the house happens to want solar panels. From a design perspective, it's essential to be able to see the grid as a city, to see the city as an organism that consumes energy, and to target areas of the grid with appropriate technology in order for those technologies to be cost effective at the system level, in order for those technologies to actually result in a phasing down of conventional power plant capacity. If you simply install solar panels without considering those impacts, then you have a symbolic gesture, which is very positive, but you haven't actually reduced the carbon footprint of your community. And so that the idea of a public design entity is something we really promote as a company, that it's the appropriate role of the city as the entity that understands what is in their city, who are the big energy users. And one of the things we got from regulators in California was full access to utility data. It was tough to get it, but we got it, and you need to get it in Ohio, as there are a few things that need to be done in Ohio to fully do this, but you can start now, and there are things you can do now. But that ability to see the city as an organism and really redesign energy systems to adapt them to the energy uses in the city, as well as adapting to local renewable resources. What have you got? What transmission have you got? How much wind have you got? How much solar have you got? What resources do you have here? And it's a matching of the load conditions to supply conditions to actually get carbon out of the system physically. Next slide, please, Gary. So, it takes time. And doing things first always takes particularly lots of time. And San Francisco, you can see, it's 2001 was the first major action, and we really had continuous effort to get the financing authority, to get an ordinance that combined the financing authority with the procurement authority, 2004, and then last summer, after 2.5 years, the city adopted an implementation plan. We just last week, my company was awarded a contract to write the contract documents and negotiate this deal with energy suppliers, which we will do over the next 6 months. Next slide, please. The benefit, however, of this approach is that it delivers nonlinear change. It's not simply a market where you're setting a target and putting in a few systems. Rather, the city will issue around $1 billion in bonds over the next few years, and after that, another billion or $2 billion to finish the job. The city will achieve a 51% renewable portfolio standard in less than 10 years. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure the more informed activists among you will naturally think, that can't be possible. You can't. You see the bottom there, the supplier must, to procure grid power, and design, build, operate, and maintain the new facilities and must meet or beat the utilities rates, PG&E, or Northern California Utilities.
Paul, you want to explain to people what a renewable portfolio standard is?
Oh, I'm sorry. The renewable portfolio standard is simply a percentage of energy generated on behalf of the community by a certain year. And currently, Ohio's just adopted a 25% standard that includes half non-renewable resources, clean coal, innovative technology. So really a 12.5% renewable portfolio standard by 2025, which is that's a good first step. California has a 20% renewable portfolio standard by 2017. That's the law under which the utilities are currently non-compliant. They're not compliant with that schedule. San Francisco will jump to 51% renewable on the same schedule. Sounds impossible. Can we go to the next slide? But it has replicated itself virally. You have not just San Francisco, but Marin County to the north has a 50% renewable portfolio standard by the same year. Oakland is in Emeryville and East Bay, the same amount. Virtually all of the cities in California that are implementing community choice are setting these extremely high renewable portfolio standards. We are designing the portfolios for several of them, and we put them forward, showed the economics. Do you go to the next slide, please, Gary? And this is an example of the most ambitious RPS in California. We designed this one, and so I understand the laughter. It is 66% renewable portfolio standard by 2017 at the same rates that are currently being charged customers in that jurisdiction, okay? That causes a 60% carbon reduction. The rate is, if you see in row 40, the fourth column from the right, that's the cost of power from that portfolio. 8.5 cents. Go to the next slide, please. So here's I don't know what happened there. I guess I have an Apple computer, and this appears to have eliminated one of the slides, but this is the more important one here. This is the portfolio, and you'll see that red part, slice of the pie there, is geothermal. Sonoma has a magnificent geothermal resource. It's virtually a huge volcano, and it's underutilized. There is virtually no geothermal heating right now in Sonoma, and so Pacific Gas and Electric, which is a gas and electric company, has neglected a world-class technology replacement of its gas business, and the radical opportunity in Sonoma is geothermal heat. The county can be heated entirely by geothermal. Any home can be heated by geothermal. All you have to do is drill down about 100 feet, and you get 100-degree water. It's very cheap, and it enables the jurisdiction to cross over into gas, not merely electricity. And electricity can also be generated from geothermal superheated steam. You can see there the wind conditions in Sonoma are not that great. Part of of a comprehensive approach to carbon is localization. So if you don't have local wind, it's better to move on rather than going 300 miles away for a remote wind farm, because the transmission line to that wind farm is going to cause an enormous amount of carbon, and it will incent, because of the 20% generation, 80% non-generation on the line, you effectively have a lack of debt service on that transmission line, and it tends to be followed by conventional fossil fuel power plants that use the capacity on the line, and it keeps you in that heavy carbon, 70% carbon producing paradigm. Next slide, please. So it's getting out of the public policy box opens up the game, and I want to go back to Sonoma. The next slide will show you, if I remember correctly. The next one. Sorry, Gary. No, forward. Sorry, I meant to go forward. I said go back, but I meant forward. This is the basic model of the plan we did there. Now, if you go back to the killing of the electric car, I mean, some of you probably saw Who Killed the Electric Car. And, of course, the film blamed it on General Motors. And, of course, they were primarily responsible for killing it. However, Gray Davis, the former governor, was the one who signed the order to kill the electric car. However, the key factor in limiting the proliferation of electric cars was the lack of infrastructure to power them. When you buy an electric car, sometimes it comes with a 220 charger, and sometimes it comes with an extension cord. The infrastructure for electric cars currently, the status quo, is an electric cord. That's it. And so you're expected, when you buy your electric vehicle, to just find somewhere to plug it in. And that's the solution to power for your electric vehicle. It's a serious problem, which inherently limits the uptake of the technology. We could say, well, gee, just deal with it, you know? It goes back to the lifestyle issue. Be more tough. Don't be such a wimp. Why do you need infrastructure to support your electric car? Okay, but the fact of the matter is, if you want to get carbon out of the system, you got to have infrastructure to support the electric car. And one of the great opportunities that we're really focusing on now in Sonoma, if you see on the right side of that, is the green bubbles on the right side, is that when you're building renewable energy infrastructure for your buildings and for lighting and heating, you have the opportunity to build infrastructure for electric vehicles. You also have the opportunity to build infrastructure for biofuels. I know they're controversial, but for the small component of carbon reductions that can be achieved through local biofuels in Sonoma County, there's a lot of agricultural waste. That waste can and should be harvested into methane, and that methane used for biofuels, for biodiesel. At the local level, it is an effective and legitimate use of biofuels. And to make biofuels, you need heat. Cogeneration facilities provide heat, and so cogeneration facilities are an opportunity to make biofuels. And so then you go to the use of public fleets and the integration of fleets. If you want to build electric vehicles and make them available to the public, you need charging stations or you need battery exchanges. And a key opportunity for that is to establish a basic infrastructure of public vehicles powered by your new infrastructure to ensure that revenues remain cycling to support that infrastructure. The chicken and egg problem with the electric vehicle is you can make your electric vehicle, but there's no infrastructure to support it. If you start an electric vehicle charging station, there's no cars to come and get charged. And so it's essential to go ahead with these vehicles that the chicken and the egg be developed simultaneously, the infrastructure and the cars. And municipal public fleets, police cars, garbage trucks, taxi cabs, buses, these which are routinely procured by local governments, are an opportunity to cross over from renewable energy infrastructure to renewably powered vehicles. That revenue sustainability then provides an envelope for offering those fuels and those vehicles to the private sector. They can come in and piggyback because it's locally based, you have local use, you have local infrastructure support. And so if you go to the next slide, please, Gary. This is the snapshot of the climate action plan that we completed recently. It has not been released yet, but this is the greenhouse gas reduction model. You'll see on the top, the dark purple is the electricity component of the carbon reduction. You'll see it's relatively small. California's energy currently is primarily hydro and nuclear. Natural gas based, there's very little coal used for generation in California. So the amount of carbon that we're pulling out of electricity alone is smaller than what is leveraged by those revenues. It is the investment in the infrastructure in electricity that leverages the investment in the infrastructure in net transportation, which in California is the largest cause, and in natural gas system replacements. In Ohio, obviously, you're using coal. So the largest cause of greenhouse gases here is coal combustion for power. About but the near second is transportation. Both can be leveraged through this approach. It isn't just a matter of gas and electricity. Next, please. Oh dear. Oh, that's a pity. These are illustrations of the difference between the Sonoma Climate Action Plan. You can go ahead, though.
Can you see if it's hiding in here somewhere?
It's just Windows versus Apple. It's
Okay.
because I have an Apple. And, yeah. Oh yeah. We have effectively a 60% CO2 reduction in the power sector from the plan, and I wish you could see the difference, but it is the difference between heaven and hell. With staying, with the current utility and going to this plan. Next, please. So, coming back to the political level, some elected officials responded to this by saying, this is great, love it, 50,000 feet, solve the world's problems, but we have voters to deal with here, and voters want cheaper power. We have a gas crisis today. What happened? We had, last month it was all about global warming and North Pole melting, and this month we have to drill for more oil because our gasoline's too expensive. It's as if climate change just disappeared. There's an utter and total disconnect between these two discussions, and the implications for the future of the world are catastrophic. The incoherency, the schizophrenia, the political schizophrenia of this country and the world is incredibly dangerous. So it is important to be able to sell this to consumers at this sort of inner reptile level. And I always recognize the importance of that. The inner reptile today, fortunately, because one of the positive byproducts of the energy crisis is that it has caused fear, because fear is something people understand. And today, whereas 10 years ago, consumers were being sold deregulation based upon the promise of cheaper power tomorrow, that notion is more or less vaporized. There is no more desire, really, for short-term cheap power. Instead, I think, in a sense, California may be ahead because it's been through the ringer already. The energy crisis burned everyone's nerve endings on the subject of energy. No longer is anyone talking about getting cheaper power tomorrow. What they're concerned about is they want protection against increasing volatility in the energy sector. They're afraid. They're afraid of the price of natural gas doubling again. They're not afraid of a 5% increase. They're afraid of a 50%, 100%. They're afraid it's going to double again. It'll be like Paris, where it's $10 a gallon, which it is right now in Paris. They're afraid of economic devastation, and it's a legitimate fear. So, number one, community choice can be sold and should be sold to the public as a way of inserting one degree of separation between us and them. Currently, the way we pay for energy is that whatever happens to the cost of fuel, we pay for it. It doesn't matter who's responsible, the customer pays. Under community choice, you have the opportunity to insert a supplier, a risk-bearing entity, who will take on more of that risk first. Second, invest in technology that physically reduces your use of fuels. Renewable energy does not use fuels. And by reducing your use of fuels in your day-to-day electricity use and gas use, you reduce your exposure to the commodity price of those fuels. So you reduce your exposure to volatility in the market, you reduce your exposure to the impacts of speculation in the market. Then there's the sort of coming disaster, which is the carbon tax. And this is a disaster particularly applicable to the state of Ohio. Because of your heavy reliance upon coal, when carbon taxes arrive, and they will arrive, Wall Street is already assuming that they're coming, it's a done deal. It's a political done deal. Carbon taxes will come, and they will hit Ohio very heavily because your carbon footprint is so bad. It's terrible. It's Chinese-level terrible, really. And this over-reliance on coal, which is a long political history and many different reasons behind it, and very high stakes for employment in the state and for economic prosperity in the state, means that when carbon taxes come, they're going to cause economic pain. And you have the opportunity now to think ahead, to recognize what's coming, because it's coming just as clearly as the North Pole is melting, and to prevent economic pain in the future. It's an opportunity to do that, and it is the a level of concern and a criterion for action that anybody will understand. You can get out of the cheaper power tomorrow box and put forward a more profound reality which has arrived and is irreversible, and put forward an opportunity to do something about it so that you're ready when it hits and you don't get devastated. You don't feel the pain because you thought ahead. I think that's the end here. The next. So Ohio CCA. There's one more slide here. You've had the law since 1999. NOPEC in the north. I just met with the head of NOPEC up in the Cleveland area, and they are someone to look at because they have now 7 years of experience. They've been very successful. They have not focused on renewable energy. They have not gotten into issuing bonds. However, Lee Harrington, who's the current executive director of NOPEC, former state senator who ushered through the CCA legislation in 1999, is a good man. He wants to do something about the environment, I think genuinely. He has a lot of political depth and experience with the law. He has improved the law. He's been effective at the legislature and recently improving the law in the Governor Strickland's re-regulation legislation that preserved CCA in Ohio and improved it slightly. The 2-year opt-out requirement was one problem in the 1999 law that was improved upon in Governor Strickland's bill. It's been increased to a 3-year opt-out requirement. This sounds as a minor detail, but it does impact the range of options available to communities in Ohio. Currently, state law requires that every 3 years, consumers be offered an exit from the program. Now, no other state has this exit. I believe it was inserted by the utilities, and what it does is it limits the ability of communities to make investments in long-term infrastructure. And they're not limited, right? As utilities, they're making 20 and 30-year investments in coal-fired power plants every day, but they're trying to limit the ability of communities to do so. What it means is that you need to remove the 3-year opt-out requirement. NOPEC is interested in supporting that change. They were very effective in supporting the recent changes. I'm meeting tomorrow with Janine Migden Ostrander, the Ohio Consumer Council, who happens to be the sister of the senator who sponsored California's community choice law, Carol Migden, the senator from San Francisco. She's very supportive of community choice in Ohio for the opportunity for cities to go green, and she will also support this I believe, from conversations with her, this minor change in the law that would really help you. In the meantime, one of the lessons, though, that I've learned in energy is it's such a big game that you have your sort of political. If those of you who want to go ahead with this and pursue this, you have to get out of the serial political environment where you think first change the law, then implement the law, then build. No. Energy is all about parallel processes. Everything takes so much time. If you want to do something, you do everything simultaneously. And so I would urge you very strongly to proceed with local plans for implementation of your local community's goals. Open up those plans regionally to other communities in this county, in this region. Invite other communities to join you. Make the basic decisions about what you want. Deal with the forest now and the trees later. That is, arrive at this is what we did in San Francisco. Arrive at your basic values, what you think you want to achieve, like the 51% renewable portfolio standard. This is something that just grew like wildfire in California because once it got out there that one city wanted to do it, well, then other cities wanted to do it. Who doesn't want 51% green power? You say, okay, we want 51% green power. We're not looking for cheaper power. Basic principle. That's the one major factor constraining supply. If you're looking for power that's the same price, it's very different from asking for something that's 1% cheaper. It sounds like a minor distinction, but it's not. It's a major distinction. Because energy markets are so non-competitive, it's like selling steel washers. Wholesale markets for steel washers. Steel washers cost what they cost. Doesn't matter if they're made by company A or company B. They cost what they cost. Energy is very similar. And focusing the public on the notion of a meet or beat service, that you're looking for a greening of your electricity, your energy service, at the same price you're paying now. Or better, but not requiring better, just the same or better. That is an enormous, I would encourage you to think about that, to focus on what you want and defining just the macro level, the simplest level of what the community is looking for. And then proceed with implementation as you go to the legislature. It gives contour and meaning and substance to what you're doing. It takes you out of the hypothetical, the policy world, and it puts you into a more substantial, real, colored, nuanced concept for what it is you're after. A thing, not a policy. You're trying to produce an event, a public works project, not a policy. It's far more compelling to the public, to policymakers, to regulators, if you present it that way. And that way you put your first foot forward on the big picture and not on the details. In the meantime, you pursue changing, removing the barriers to what you want to do. There are other barriers, and you can. We're meeting with Ms. Migden Ostrander tomorrow to talk about some of them. There's a lot of complexity in electricity markets, and it can be intimidating because there's so many details that affect how much something costs and what you physically can do. But the important thing is to define what the big picture, and then proceed with the big picture. By then, when you encounter the barrier, you have moral authority, because the barrier is preventing something that everyone wants, as opposed to preventing a general policy framework from going forward. And then, in the short term, an emphasis on energy efficiency and demand-side resources, critical. Why? Because the paybacks are so short. You can easily make these investments. They will save you money. They will not cost extra. And so it's kind of you can go forward with a demand-side approach and have confidence that they will succeed more or less irrespective of your political program, of what laws and regulations you can change. And I think that's the end of it there. Is that right, Gary? Would you check the next? Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Well,
It's a mouthful.
we hope you have time for a few questions.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, and we have microphones on the table there, 3 of them. If anyone would like to come up and ask a question, make a comment. I'd like to start by thanking you. You've given much information and lots of working information, ways to do things. Appreciate it. I'm a little overwhelmed at this
My
point.
pleasure. Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, is there someone who'd like to come forward? Just name and, please, name and ask away. They're little,
Are these microphones?
yes, those little things.
Sit at the table. You don't have to, just sit down,
Sit down, relax.
relax.
Yes, my name is Gary Bruce. I'm a retired city employee. You were talking about solar power and wind power versus coal power, but no mention at all about hydroelectric power. I know that's not real big in our area here, but if you look at the country as a whole, how important is that? And also in Canada, they don't hardly use the word electricity up there. When they refer to their transmission lines, they're called the hydro. And I just wondered how we compared with Canada.
The hydro, I certainly wouldn't want to neglect it. In California, hydro is not classified as a renewable resource because of the impacts on ecology, the rivers, and so there are, it's somewhat controversial. But hydro is not classified as renewable, and so we don't include it as a renewable large hydro as a renewable resource. The hydro also causes significant mercury contamination in fish. Mercury is another major problem. The mental retardation in children in the United States is shocking, and the toxic level of mercury toxicity in U.S. rivers is virtually ubiquitous. And so it's somewhat of a sensitive issue around hydro. I believe strongly in small hydro, and opportunities for small hydro are very significant. I have a lot of rivers here in the state. It may be that there are. I'm a firm believer in focusing on local renewable resources and not sort of generically saying it has to be wind and solar because that's what the market says. So my company has no clients in the state of Ohio, so I've never surveyed the resources here and couldn't credibly answer the question about the feasibility of hydro here. But just to make that distinction between large hydro and small hydro, large hydro has its own problems. It also, because of the biomass impacts of hydro, it actually releases significant greenhouse gases when you build dams. And so from a carbon perspective, it's a somewhat limited opportunity and with some negative side effects. But I certainly wouldn't want to contest the potential importance of hydro in the state. I just couldn't comment on it because I haven't studied it.
Okay, I just was wondering how we compared with Canada. So.
In terms of the resource, or
in terms of hydroelectric power
capacity?
I know the history here, of course, for more than 100 years has been coal.
Yes.
And so, while it's coal here, I would think that it's hydroelectric power in Canada.
It is.
Yeah.
They also have more oil than Saudi Arabia, so that's part of the reason their economy is booming while ours goes in the tank, because they've got all that hydro and all that oil. But and I don't know. I just don't know what the resources. Perhaps others in the room might know. This is a local resource, so there may be activists out there that are aware of what there is, but I have not studied it.
Thank you.
Scary. There's some others over here. There's another one right over there if you want to come.
Nancy, Paul and I have a one-page handout.
Sure.
Well, as a follow-up on this hydro question, you did some work in northeast Ohio. And it's my understanding that some of that comes from the Niagara Falls. So aren't we now getting some parts of Ohio from hydropower? And what does the mercury pollution problem have to do with the Niagara Falls?
I did not work for NOPEC. So in Ohio, my role is limited to helping draft the law that authorizes community choice aggregation. That's it. If NOPEC takes hydropower, I've not heard about it. I was just up at Niagara because I went up to Ontario and passed through Niagara. The mercury comes from the soil. I did work when I worked in the Massachusetts Senate. Hydro-Quebec came down, and the Native American tribes that lived up in the flooded areas of Quebec came down to the United States, trying to persuade the state governments on the East Coast to refuse to take their power because of the impacts on fish. And there is mercury in the soil, and when flooding occurs, the mercury rises into the water and the fish consume it. So the mercury toxicity of fish is caused by these dams, and it has made it impossible for those Native Americans to fish and to live off of fish. Much of the mercury that's in the soil, obviously, was delivered there by coal. But it just so happens that a secondary effect occurs with hydro, where it becomes waterborne, and the fish consume it. And so part of the reason why virtually all rivers in the United States are considered unsafe for pregnant women to eat the fish in is a result of that combination of coal plant mercury ending up in the rivers.
Go ahead.
I've been working on energy about 4 times as long as you have.
Oh dear.
But from the engineering viewpoint and not from the political economic viewpoint.
Okay.
I agree with very much of what you say. However, there is a very fundamental problem, and that is that we get so much energy from the use of fossil fuels today that it's extremely difficult to visualize any sustainable source that could come close to matching the amount of energy that comes from fossil fuels. And as we all know, the fossil fuel use has got to go down because there's less of it available at a low cost. And for those of you who want solutions, I have written out the entire solution for the entire world here.
And for those who
Thank you,
don't
William.
know,
I've got 20 copies, so it's going to go fast. But the point is that in Athens, Ohio, where I've lived for quite a while, there is a grossly underutilized source, which is biomass. And when you look at this, the possibility of converting biomass into methane or what is called wood gas and driving vehicles with it, you can visualize a sustainable community at a very much lower level of energy, I must say, at a very much lower level of energy, which will, in fact, be sustainable for a more or less indefinite period of time if we use the resources we have today in a smart manner. And I'm very much hoping that some entrepreneurs will look at these papers I've written and start the businesses to do this. I'm not going to do it. I'm not a businessman, I'm an engineer, but there are enormous opportunities here to do something worthwhile. And I do agree with most of what you say. It's a little bit light on the engineering side. Of course, that's my own prejudice.
No, I agree with the notion that you can't really replace the fossil fuel system with green power supply. And I try to make the same statement, and perhaps I didn't make it well enough. The reason we have that really odd logo for our company is it's an effort to demonstrate a notion, which is replacing a whole symmetrical, transcendent energy supply system that always works. It's fully dispatchable. It works when you always have energy, you always have supply, with a system based on intermittency, and in which the demand-side technology is used to manage loads in relation to that intermittency. Is to replace a transcendent system that's always on with an intermittent system in which the load is managed in relation to that intermittency. So it's, rather than this whole single system, many complex attenuated systems that replace it. But I would agree that one of the factors that's poisoned the national debate is this assumption that we went from, from wood to coal to oil to gas. What's the next big thing? That's the wrong question. There is no next big thing. The next big thing is the problem. The only thing to replace oil or natural gas with is 100 things. And so the challenge is no longer the technology per se, but rather how do you deploy 100 technologies at the same time in a single contract? There's no single solution, but rather, so the challenge is no longer technological, it is political, because only a government can do that. A market can't do that. And so I sort of partly agree with what you're saying, and I certainly would be interested in learning more about biomass, and I'd like one of those papers.
Just one quick comment. There's an extremely old storage system that really works, and that's pumped hydro. It's been around for 150 years,
Yep.
and it's used all over the planet.
Yeah,
And it can store a very large amount of energy.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Actually, that was going to be my question. Do you have any information on the economics of doing that on a municipal level, the pumped hydro storage? But I also wanted to comment that what you were just talking about was the magic bullet approach to energy, and petroleum was the magic bullet. And the closest thing we have to a magic bullet now is the conservation, or as you put it, the supply or demand side technology.
I agree. It's the closest thing because it is so. It's the most neglected part of the system that rests on throughputs, on maximization of sales, and so it's the most neglected technology. It happens to be the cheapest, but even it is not a silver bullet. Every technology category is limited for various reasons, and it's the ability to integrate that is the real opportunity. And so these devices, and the emphasis for us as a company is not on the technology. We evaluate them for how well they can be integrated with other technologies, but the key is, can you set the financing vehicle? Can you provide the financing vehicle to an entity that does not own the transmission infrastructure? Critical, because if it does, even though it has the vehicle, it won't implement the vehicle. And so to have a sort of we call a public design entity that has is in a strategic position to implement fully, has the authority to finance, and has the authority to control revenue. If you can establish that entity, then you've established an agency that has it has its hands free to actually try to achieve carbon reductions. So, Gary.
As you might imagine, I have more than one question. For those who don't know me, my name is Gary Hauser. I'm the co-founder of the Ohio University Eco House Project here in Athens. And the first question I'd like to start out with is that very point of we have a local economy that is very much dominated by the presence of a very large state university, Ohio University. And it seems to me it would be a key component of putting together a successful community choice aggregation plan in Athens would be to find some way for the city of Athens to really work out a strong cooperative relationship with the university. I'm wondering if you could speak about your experience in San Francisco in drawing in the university campuses in the same plan to work together with the city of San Francisco. The second question is, a lot of people talk about energy efficiency as being what's called the low-hanging fruit. And could you also go into more particulars on how the CCA in San Francisco is going to provide leadership to moving the city's consumption of electricity downward through implementing energy efficiency programs? Third question, could you, and I know you can probably go through these fairly rapidly, but the third one is, could you just lead us, like to make this process more tangible to us here in Athens, could you lead us through the immediate next steps that the city of Athens would need to take if it wanted to move further in this kind of direction, tangible next steps?
Okay. On the university question, yes, we have core to the university. Large energy users are very important to aggregations, not only because of their volume, but because of the load pattern, the energy usage pattern. The load profile of a community determines the cost of its power. So if you have only daytime use and no nighttime use or very little, that's a problem, and vice versa is a problem. The more balanced you are, the more, in other words, if you go on a 24-hour cycle and your energy is in a straight line, that's ideal. Your energy usage in the daytime is the same as your energy usage in the nighttime. Then the price of your power will be the lowest. And so the need to have nighttime energy users and daytime energy users combined into the aggregation will improve your economics and make it more feasible. And universities come into play there. You also have the intermittency issues around the fact that students leave in the summertime. And so your loads will drop when they're gone. That's an issue. So it's a sort of a planning issue, and there's a need to try to mitigate the impacts of that volatility, that load volatility during the summertime when energy costs, well, for you they probably drop, I would imagine, because it's so cold in the winter here. But again, you have to look at the annual energy usage and figure out and strategize around that issue plan. It's very important to bring them in. We've made great efforts to court all the large customers in San Francisco. In the city, 50 customers consume over half of the power in the city. Something shocking about cities is that commercial industrial businesses use a lot more energy than residents do. And so their participation is critical. Support of the business community is very important. On the energy efficiency question, San Francisco will roll out 107 megawatts of efficiency measures and conservation measures within the initial 360 megawatt rollout of photovoltaics and wind and other distributed generation. So it is around a third of what will be installed. Now, as my company that was our first portfolio design in San Francisco. We've moved on to other cities, and as we've gone from city to city, we found ourselves increasing the role of the demand side in the portfolio design because it's so cost effective. Effectively, the more you do, the cheaper your power will be, the cheaper your overall portfolio will be. So now we're up around 50%, where half of the investment is in energy efficiency and demand side technology, and half in new capacity. And we kind of believe that's a kind of a standard that when you implement a renewable portfolio standard of any kind, that half of it should be demand side, ideally. That means you have to drive up the annual load reduction assumptions and modeling. Currently, the state of the art in the United States is NYSERDA. New York has the most successful energy efficiency program statewide, and I think they've achieved a 2% per year load reductions from minus growth from their programs. In California, the best and the brightest are doing 0.7% per year. That's PG&E, and they spend a great deal of money to do that because they burn most of the money deliberately. We're driving them up to 3% per year, and we believe that can be achieved through this rollout approach, where you're not just marketing products to the residents and businesses, but you're treating it as infrastructure rollout, and you're financing it. So if you go for a 3% per year, it really changes the 10-year and the 20-year prospect of load in the community. It has enormous benefits to the cost of power 10 years from now. I mean, the harvest of energy efficiency in the 10-year cycle is pretty dramatic. And so we're pushing for 3% per year, or 50% of any renewable portfolio. The final question was on
Tangible description of immediate next steps.
next steps. Right. The first step to take is a resolution. The great thing about resolutions is they're non-binding, so they're relatively easy to adopt. In community choice, the basic idea is that you proceed from the informal to the formal. You do nothing that exposes your jurisdiction to any risk or commitment until the very end of the process. So you start out very informally talking about what you resolve to do. And so the first thing to resolve about is that you want to pursue it. So a resolution saying that you want to pursue community choice aggregation, and that what your criteria are, that your interest is. What I would encourage you to do is that your interest is not in obtaining a discount in your energy costs, but in stabilizing your energy costs. The principle of meet or beat I think is very useful. You basically frame the policy for the public. So you give them something to understand about what you're up to. And the basic contours of a program generally are: how green do you want to be? How much risk do you want to take? And what do you want to do with rates? And so our view is the best answer to those questions are rates stay the same or are better, but they can be the same. That you want to go set some impressive standard of greenness over a 10-year time frame. I think 10 years is meaningful. If you go to 20 years, you're getting the la-la land, and it's politically responsible because most elected officials will not be here in 20 years, and versus 10 years, some of you might be, and so it's more meaningful, and those who lead will have a chance to carry the ball all the way to the end, which usually is essential to making the policy successful. And then on risk, to clarify the role of the city. The first issue is what kind of municipal financing you want to employ. Revenue bonds, which are minimum risk to the general fund. They don't expose the general fund. They don't expose taxpayers. They limit you to a 20-year horizon, and they limit how green you can go. Capital bonds are the next level of risk. They involve some general fund exposure, but they enable you to go to a 30-year time frame, and they allow you to go into this sort of 66% land. Because you're financing that far forward, you're capturing that much revenue, you can finance that much more infrastructure within a single contract. And the whole issue is, what can you do in one agreement? Because what you really do today will be in that one agreement. Everything else will be a goal that the next city council may or may not implement. And so the question is, how far do you want to go within one agreement? You frame it that way. And so the resolution is non-binding, but it clarifies the discussion going forward. It allows you, the leaders, to take leadership rather than waiting for consensus. You put it on the table, you define it, let people come and comment on it. And then the risk profile also relates to performance risk, and there's some details to clarify about questions like what happens if the supplier goes bankrupt, or what happens if the supplier doesn't roll out renewables like they're supposed to. There's certain little bonding requirements that if you clarify early on, then the utility can't come in and say, hey, you're going to bankrupt your town, because you've already covered that base. What happens in a worst case scenario? So that sort of giving contour to the program in a resolution form allows you then to define the thing and go forward and become more formal. You also, in the resolution, can start the process of inviting neighboring jurisdictions to join you, which is a very important thing. Not to wait for them to join you, but go ahead. It's very important to just go ahead unilaterally, but to invite other jurisdictions to join. The Cape Light Compact was started by one town, and it took them a long time to get it passed, but once they passed, it was a couple of months before 6 other towns joined them. Being the leader helps enormously. Gives people the opportunity to themselves choose what you're standing for or not. And I've been shocked by how responsive towns are. After being hesitant to do anything, how eagerly they jump on someone else, on the piggyback on someone else's leadership. I think it's a great way to start things. And certainly work with the Cape Light Compact. NOPEC was amazing because it was incredible. I mean, hundreds of these referenda to form CCAs. Now, in their case, they were just going for a discount, so it wasn't terribly inspiring, but you can put it forward. Then you want to place, ultimately, want to place a resolution on the ballot for the voters, because you must under state law to approve the program. And so in that process, you begin to negotiate with suppliers, and ultimately you will adopt an ordinance to implement the program, and you will probably, I have to study the local laws here, but you probably will adopt an ordinance to issue the bonds, I guess. So you basically go from resolution to referendum to ordinance to procurement ordinance to bond ordinance. And then at that point, you're actually locked in. There is a degree of accountability, but you wait until you've gotten public support to go to market, and you negotiate with suppliers to see who's willing to do what for you. And once the agreements are submitted, then you have your real political decision: are we going to do this or not? Are we going to approve this contract or not? And so something along those lines.
Matthew Bennett, Dovetail Solar and Wind.
Sure.
Thank you, Paul, for coming here.
Thank
I know
you.
You've been touring all around the state. You're in Cleveland already today, and you must be exhausted at this point.
Oh, it's exciting! My God, all this stuff. I love to see this. It sounds like a politician's speech, but I'm not running for office, so I mean it. The people really underestimate how powerful even 50 people that want to do something is in politics. It's extremely powerful. And so it's great to see you, because obviously there's a lot of interest in this community to do something, and you might actually do it, and it's
My question, similar to how we talked about the energy mix, or the solution being a mix of diverse sources, or whatever sources are locally appropriate. I'm wondering about the diversity of approaches in deploying those resources, and what other options are there besides rolling out large bonds, and what options are there in terms of how those bonds are rolled out to break things up into pieces that can be implemented locally? Because since we don't have a large infrastructure for solar, and there are really only a handful of companies in the state installing solar, for instance, if we roll out one huge bond like you did in San Francisco, or the scale, obviously it'll be smaller here, but we're risking basically having to use companies from out of state to implement this, and thus the money going away from the community and away from the region. How can we design this project in a way to make it more decentralized in a way that allows Ohio companies and Ohio manufacturers to be involved in the deployment? And I think that, as most people probably know, we don't have good wind resources here in Southeast Ohio. We don't have, a volcano 100 feet down. We don't have hydro. We have some old dams on the river which are being retrofitted with small hydro, which is not maybe as good as tearing the dams out, but it's not adding additional dams. We're mostly retrofitting. But we are somewhat limited in our choices, and solar is clearly one of the options that is available and deployable right now. Solar is here, it works,
Yep.
it's long-lasting, it's really reliable. So how can we tailor our system to work for what we have, the resources that we have, and the infrastructure and installation capacity that we have?
Well, there are several sides of that question. One is the sort of choice of technology, and I agree, you have to choose what you've got. And so if solar is what you've got and biomass is what you've got, then do solar and biomass. The demand side, everyone's got demand, and so demand side technology works everywhere and should be a big piece of the action. As far as the local hiring, I have seen some jurisdictions condition their contracts to award points to suppliers that use local installers, contractors to do the work. I've seen other communities require suppliers to do so. There are often state laws that constrain the ability of cities to do that. So it depends on your kind of legal constraints in the city, what it's able to do legally. Some cities have actually required that city residents must be hired, or that points should be awarded in the competitive bidding process to those who commit to hiring locals. So there are ways to ensure that the economic benefits are local, and I agree that it's important that they be so in order for sustainability, economic sustainability, to result.
So we're talking about a lot of money, and traditionally, so much of the extraction of resources has been controlled, by out of state, and so it would just be a shame to go down this road and see millions of dollars exiting the economy.
Yeah, I
so
agree with you.
I'm wondering, with the bond itself, is there a way to structure the bond, or how are you doing it in San Francisco? Is it broken down into chunks, megawatt chunks, or is there a process for how that's put out?
One of the key factors here in making this approach work is that you actually do need a fairly significant financial entity to underwrite your agreements. So if you want a guarantee to residents and businesses that their rates will meet or beat the existing rates, then you've got to have one entity that's legally liable for both the commodity service delivery and the rollout. Otherwise, if you basically have a lawsuit nightmare on your hands. And from a risk perspective, this is one of the issues that will come up when you try to implement programs. The utility will come in and say, this is going to bankrupt your general fund. If this worst case scenario occurs, you have a disaster. You're going to have 20 lawsuits. It's very important. We call it the single lawsuit strategy. It's very important that you structure your deals so if things go badly, there's one entity you're going to sue. And in fact, it's better to arrange it so they have to sue you. And so you basically arrange the bond so that they're deprived of payment. And so they will have to sue you in the situation. You don't want to have a situation where you've broken up the contract into 25 pieces and the photovoltaics component are working for some staff person in the city, and the commodity service guy is under a totally different contract, because if your solar guy doesn't perform, and the commodity provider then has to go to wholesale markets to cover the power that's not being generated because he's not under schedule, whose fault is it? And it's all got to be bundled into one black box, to use the term of industry.
But the contracts can be awarded at whatever chunks the bonding authority wants to release them, though, right?
Well, you see, if there are chunks, there are tranches of bond issuances according to the rollout schedule of the energy service provider. But there are no chunks by category of technology.
Right.
And so, see what I'm saying? So, does that work for you?
Well, this is probably getting a little more too detailed for us after being here for so long. So,
yeah.
But I think,
we've run into this issue,
yeah.
And I understand your
I know the
concern.
interstate commerce laws prevent us from saying you have to use Ohio installers, but the scale of each award can be adjusted. It's just like you said, the points can be adjusted. There are small things that can be done to keep the local economy as involved as possible. So
Yes, and I think you should do that.
So at this point, I'd like to say we could continue the conversation perhaps on a more individual level and adjourn this meeting. If that's all right with everyone. I see some people are trying to move out, so this is one conversation and many to be held in the future, I'm sure, once the law is back. We'll keep you in mind. Thank you.